It started with an invitation, one that seemed innocent at first, handwritten in an elaborate cursive, sealed with a wax stamp that bore the imprint of an unfamiliar crest. The recipient, Daniel Whitaker, was no stranger to peculiar requests. As a historian specializing in abandoned estates, he had received countless letters from estate lawyers and distant relatives of long-forgotten property owners, hoping he could shed light on the past. But this one was different. The letter contained no sender's name, no return address, only an elegant request. Mr. Whitaker, you are cordially invited to the Vance estate for a weekend of research and discovery. Accommodations will be provided, and your presence is of the utmost importance. You will find the key enclosed. The house awaits. Daniel found the wording unsettling. The house awaits, as if the estate itself were expecting him. Yet curiosity often led him to places most would rather forget, and this was no exception. With his travel bag packed and the rusted key in hand, he set off in his old station wagon, the coordinates provided on a separate slip of paper. The drive took him farther than he had anticipated, away from the comfort of paved roads and into the wilderness where the trees grew too close together and the air smelled thick with rot. The first real sign of trouble came when his GPS lost signal. The second came when the dirt road beneath his tires turned to a wet, sinking mess, his wheels struggling against the pull of the earth. By the time he reached the house, the sun was little more than a sliver on the horizon, its light weak and unconvincing. The Vance estate loomed in front of him, tall, skeletal, and wrong in ways he could not immediately define. The structure itself was old, but not in the way abandoned homes usually were. There was no ivy strangling its walls, no windows broken by time or vandals. Instead, it stood pristine, as though it had been built just yesterday, but with an architecture centuries out of place. The wood was dark, polished, yet damp to the touch, as if the swamp that surrounded it had claimed it as part of its own. The porch creaked under his weight, and when he lifted the key to the lock, it turned too easily, almost eagerly. Inside, the air was heavy, not with dust or decay, but with something else entirely, something alive. The candlelight flickered, though he had yet to see the source of any flame. Furniture, too, was untouched by time, arranged as though someone had been expecting him. A long dining table stretched across the main hall, its surface set for a meal that had yet to be served. Silverware gleamed under the dim light, but the plates were empty, save for a fine layer of condensation, as if they had only just been placed. Daniel called out, though he had no reason to expect a reply. His voice did not echo. Instead, it was absorbed into the walls, swallowed by the thick wooden beams and the floor that seemed to shift beneath him. He felt watched, but not by eyes, by the house itself. At the end of the hall, a staircase wound upward, disappearing into darkness. There were no portraits, no photographs, nothing to suggest who had lived here or why he had been summoned. Only the vague sensation that he was not the first to stand in this entryway, hesitant, uncertain, and regretting his arrival. The invitation had said accommodations would be provided, but Daniel saw no evidence of any living quarters. Just rooms with closed doors and hallways that stretched farther than the house should have allowed. The key in his pocket suddenly felt heavier, as if the weight of it had grown since his arrival. He should have left then, turned on his heel, walked back to his car, and driven until the road reappeared beneath his tires. But he didn't. Something about the house, it was waiting, and deep inside, Daniel had already decided to see what it was waiting for. Daniel stepped forward, his footsteps swallowed by the thick wooden floor, the air heavy with something he couldn't name. He paused for a moment, listening. The silence in the house was unnatural, not the stillness of an empty home, but something more deliberate. It was the silence of something waiting. He turned his attention to the staircase, its curved banister smooth and cool beneath his fingertips, leading up to a second floor shrouded in darkness. He hesitated. The logical part of his mind told him to locate a light switch, but something about the house suggested it wouldn't have one. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small flashlight. The beam cut through the thick shadows, revealing wallpaper with a faint, undulating pattern, one that seemed to shift when he wasn't looking directly at it. The light flickered. He tapped the casing, blaming the battery, but a chill crawled up his spine as he realized that the air itself had moved. It wasn't a breeze or a draft. It was a breath. Daniel exhaled slowly, stepping back. The sensation of the house breathing wasn't an illusion. He could feel it in the way the walls seemed to expand just slightly, then contract again. It wasn't visible to the eye, but it was there, a rhythmic inhalation and exhalation like a great, sleeping creature. He had spent years inside crumbling mansions, forgotten estates, places where history clung to the walls like a parasite. But this was different. This house was awake. A sound broke the silence. A low, deliberate creak from the floorboards above him. He froze. The sound wasn't the random groan of an old house settling. It was footsteps, slow, measured, not pacing, but moving with purpose. Daniel tilted his flashlight upward, sweeping the beam across the ceiling, expecting to see a crack or a disturbance in the wood. Instead, he saw something much worse. The chandelier above him, an ornate structure of iron and glass, was moving, not swinging as if disturbed by wind, but pulsing, its chain tightening and loosening, as though the house were flexing its grip on it. His breath caught in his throat. He needed to move. Turning back toward the hallway, he reached for the door, but the knob resisted. He twisted harder, but it would not budge. A sharp knock echoed from upstairs, followed by another. 3 knocks, then silence. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he forced himself to think. The invitation had said he was expected. But by whom? And for what purpose? He turned to the dining room. The long table stretched before him, the chairs perfectly aligned, their wooden backs smooth and untouched. The plates that had once been empty now bore remnants of something damp, moist impressions of where food should have been, as if something had been there only moments before and had been wiped away. He swallowed hard. Had he missed something when he first walked in? Or had the table changed when he wasn't looking? The knock came again. This time, it was closer. His instinct screamed at him to leave, but the door remained shut, and the windows, now that he looked, were covered in something thick and black, obscuring the outside world. He pressed his fingers against the glass. It was warm. The house was no longer just breathing. It was alive. Daniel took a step backward, his pulse hammering in his ears. He had always believed in the weight of history, that places could hold memories, that the past could leave imprints on the present. But this was something else entirely. This house was not holding on to the past. It was consuming it, and if he stayed, it might consume him too. Another knock, and then, from upstairs, a voice. A whisper. His name. Daniel stood frozen, his breath shallow, his mind racing to process what he had just heard. The voice had whispered his name, not in an urgent shout or a ghostly moan, but in a soft, deliberate murmur, as if spoken by someone who had always known he would come. His grip on the flashlight tightened as he swept its beam toward the staircase, half expecting to see a figure standing at the top, peering down at him. But there was nothing, just the yawning darkness, swallowing the weak light. He had spent years researching places like this, homes steeped in mystery, histories riddled with tragedy. But none of them had ever called him by name. His mind scrambled for an explanation. Perhaps someone had set this up? A cruel prank? But who would go through such lengths to orchestrate something like this? He was miles from civilization, in a house no one had lived in for decades, if ever. The thought sent a chill through his bones. The whisper came again. Daniel. This time it was closer. It drifted through the air, weaving through the wooden beams and the heavy drapes, as if the house itself had formed the word. He forced himself to step forward, each movement a struggle against the growing certainty that he had made a mistake coming here. He reached the base of the staircase, shining the flashlight up the steps. The old wood was smooth, unstained by dust or decay, as if countless feet had walked these stairs recently. But no footprints marked the surface. He placed his foot on the first step, and immediately the house responded. The walls exhaled a slow, deliberate shift in the air that made the candlelight waver. Halfway up the stairs, Daniel heard something new. Not a voice, not footsteps, but something much worse, a scratching sound, like fingernails dragged across wood. It came from beyond the upstairs hallway, a slow, methodical scraping that stopped the moment he hesitated. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs. He wasn't alone up there. The urge to flee burned in his chest, but something deeper, something darker, kept him moving. He reached the top step and turned the corner. The hallway stretched before him, impossibly long, lined with doors that shouldn't have fit within the dimensions of the house. Each one was identical, save for the last door at the end, which was slightly ajar. The darkness beyond it was absolute. The scratching returned. This time, it came from behind one of the closed doors, sharp and insistent, as if something inside was desperate to get out. His breath caught as he passed it, his free hand trailing along the wallpaper that felt almost like skin beneath his fingertips. He reached the open door, his pulse a hammer in his throat. Inside, the room was empty, at least at first glance. The floor was bare, save for a single wooden chair in the center, facing away from him. The air was thick, damp, carrying the scent of something long buried. His flashlight flickered again, the beam dimming for just a moment. And in that instant, the chair moved, not a sudden jerk, not a violent lurch, but a slow, deliberate scrape against the floor, as if someone unseen had just sat down. Daniel stepped backward, his body screaming at him to run. But before he could turn, before he could so much as breathe, the whisper came again. This time, it was right beside his ear. "You shouldn't have come." The flashlight died. For a moment, he was swallowed by absolute blackness, the silence stretching unbearably. Then, all at once, every door in the hallway burst open at the same time. A gust of air rushed past him, carrying with it the sound of footsteps, many footsteps, moving in all directions. Some fast, some slow, but all deliberate. Daniel stumbled backward, barely able to see in the dim glow of the dying candlelight. He wasn't alone in this house. He never had been, and whatever had whispered his name wasn't done with him yet. Daniel's breath came in short, ragged gasps as the doors in the hallway swung violently, slamming against the walls in a chaotic symphony of unseen movement. The footsteps, dozens of them, echoed in every direction, yet he saw no one. His fingers fumbled over the flashlight, slamming the switch again and again. Nothing. The batteries were new, but the light refused to return. The house had taken it from him. He pressed his back against the wall, forcing himself to remain still. If he moved blindly, he risked running into whatever was lurking just beyond sight. The whisper had spoken again. "You shouldn't have come." But why? What had drawn him here in the first place? The invitation? The story of the house? Or something deeper? Something more personal? He didn't have time to answer. The footsteps were getting closer. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The hallway fell into an oppressive silence, the only sound Daniel's own pulse thrumming in his ears. The doors, once flung open in violence, now stood eerily still. Only one remained ajar, the door at the end of the hallway, the one he had been about to enter before the house had reacted. Daniel swallowed hard. If the house was trying to scare him away, it wasn't working. If anything, it was testing him. He had seen places like this before, places where the boundaries between past and present, the living and the dead, blurred into something twisted. But this house knew him. With careful steps, he moved toward the open door, bracing for whatever was inside. His hands trembled as he reached for the edge, pushing it wider. The room was wrong. It wasn't like the others in the house. This one wasn't just old, it was decayed. The walls were rotting, the floor warped and soft beneath his weight. But worse than the decay was what stood in the center of the room. A door, not one that led deeper into the house, not a normal entryway, but a freestanding door built into the floor itself, its wooden frame warped with age. There was no staircase leading down, no basement access, just a door where no door should be. A rusted iron latch secured it shut, but the wood around it was splintered, as though someone, or something, had tried to force its way out. A pit formed in Daniel's stomach. He had studied countless haunted places, but he had never seen anything like this. The architecture made no sense. No blueprints had ever mentioned a space beneath the house. But the evidence was right in front of him. Something was trapped down there, and someone had tried to keep it that way. His fingers hovered over the latch, hesitant. Was this what he was meant to find? Was this the reason the house had called him here? His mind screamed at him to leave it alone, to turn and run. But something deeper, something instinctual, told him otherwise. If this door existed, it was because something wanted it to be found. The moment his fingertips grazed the rusted metal, the whisper returned. This time, it didn't speak his name. It laughed. The sound slithered through the air, curling around him like a noose. The walls trembled, the decay spreading like rot. The house wasn't just reacting to his presence. It was warning him. He yanked his hand back, stumbling away from the door, heart pounding. The laughter faded, replaced by something far worse. A single, deliberate knock. From the other side of the door, Daniel turned and ran, ignoring the shadows shifting in his peripheral vision, ignoring the doors lining the hallway that had somehow changed, their shapes twisted, their handles reaching for him. He didn't stop until he reached the staircase, his feet slamming against the wood as he descended in frantic, desperate movements. The house exhaled again, but this time, it wasn't just breathing. It was waking up. Daniel reached the bottom of the staircase, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. His breath came in sharp gasps, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The knock, that terrible knock from beneath the floor, still echoed in his mind. He had investigated dozens of haunted locations, but nothing had ever felt this personal. This house wasn't just haunted. It was aware. The air had changed. The musty, stagnant scent of abandonment had been replaced by something damp, almost alive, as if the walls were breathing with him. The candlelight flickered more violently than before, the flames stretching and twisting unnaturally. He turned toward the front door, his instincts screaming for escape. He needed to leave. Whatever secrets this place held, they weren't meant to be uncovered. But as he took his first step, the house shifted. It wasn't an earthquake. It wasn't the creaking of old wood. It was something deeper. The entire house seemed to lurch, not in a violent shake, but in a way that made his stomach turn, like a living thing adjusting itself. The furniture groaned as if it had moved without him seeing it. The shadows stretched along the floor in the wrong direction. Then he saw it. The front door was gone. Not shut, not blocked. Gone. The wooden panels that should have led outside had seamlessly merged with the walls, as if there had never been an exit at all. He stumbled backward, pressing his palms against the surface where the door had been, feeling only cold, solid wood. His breath hitched. The house had trapped him. Daniel turned sharply, his flashlight still dead in his grip. He needed another way out. There were windows, but as he rushed toward them, his stomach twisted again. They weren't right. The glass was clouded, as though covered in thick condensation, but when he wiped at it, his hand came away dry. The more he looked, the less they resembled windows at all. More like paintings of windows, two-dimensional and false. Then, as if responding to his realization, the whispers returned. This time many voices, layered over one another, overlapping, some in agony, some in laughter, some in an unsettling calm that chilled him to the bone. They came from every direction, swelling and twisting together like an orchestra of the damned. And then, clear and distinct above the chaos, a single voice cut through. "You were here before?" Daniel's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, searching for the source, but he was alone. The room seemed to shift again, subtly, imperceptibly. The furniture didn't move, but it wasn't quite where it had been before. The paintings on the walls were wrong. He could have sworn they had been of landscapes when he entered, but now they were something else. Faces. Not portraits, but contorted, screaming faces, frozen in expressions of terror. Their eyes were all fixed on him. Daniel staggered away, ball rising in his throat. "You were here before." The voice had said it so plainly, as if stating a fact. But that was impossible. He had never stepped foot in this place before tonight. Had he? His head throbbed. His memories, sharp and clear moments ago, were suddenly clouded. Why did this place feel familiar? He knew its history, had read about it, but that wasn't it. The feeling was deeper than knowledge. It was something primal, something buried beneath the surface of his mind, like a long-forgotten dream. A sudden creak made him snap his gaze toward the staircase. At the top, just barely visible in the flickering candlelight, stood a figure. Not a ghostly apparition, not a shadow, a man. Tall, motionless, his features obscured by the darkness. But Daniel could feel his gaze. The stranger was watching him. And then, with slow, deliberate intent, the figure raised his hand and pointed. Not at Daniel. At the floor beneath him. Daniel's stomach clenched. He didn't want to look, but his body betrayed him. His gaze dropped, and his breath caught in his throat. The wooden floorboards had changed. They were no longer the worn, splintered planks of an abandoned house. They were freshly dug earth, and buried just beneath the surface, barely visible through the shifting soil, was a hand. Daniel staggered back in horror as realization clawed at his mind. It wasn't just a house. It was a grave. And somewhere, in the depths of the shifting walls, something remembered him. Daniel stumbled backward, his breath ragged, eyes locked on the partially buried hand beneath the loose soil. It was pale, almost bluish, with dirt caked beneath the fingernails. His mind screamed for him to run, to do anything but stand there. Yet his legs felt as if they were sinking, as if the earth itself wanted to pull him under. The figure at the top of the stairs remained motionless, its arms still outstretched, its face obscured by the flickering shadows. Daniel couldn't tell if it was flesh and blood or something else entirely. It neither moved nor breathed, yet its presence filled the room like a pressure against his chest. His rational mind fought for control. This can't be real. Maybe he was hallucinating. Maybe the stress of the night had finally broken his sense of reality. He had to test it, had to be sure. With shaking hands, he crouched, hesitating only for a second before reaching out toward the buried hand. The moment his fingers brushed the dirt, the house reacted. A deep, resonant groan echoed through the walls, like the sound of an ancient structure bending under an unseen force. The whispers returned, more insistent now, the words indecipherable but urgent. And then the hand twitched. Daniel yanked his own hand back as the fingers beneath the earth began to move. Slowly at first, then with increasing urgency, the buried hand started to claw its way upward, fingers flexing, dirt crumbling away as something struggled to rise. The room grew colder, not the natural chill of an old house, but a deep, biting cold that sank into his bones, that made the candle flames burn lower, as if the light itself was being smothered. Then the floor cracked. Not just the floorboards, the illusion of the floor itself. The soil beneath his feet darkened, spread outward, like a stain seeping through reality. And then, suddenly, impossibly, it wasn't a floor at all. Daniel wasn't standing in a house anymore. He was standing on a graveyard. The walls around him had vanished, replaced by an endless, moonlit field of tilted, weathered tombstones. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth, the ground uneven beneath his feet. The only thing that remained of the house was the staircase, and at the top, the figure still stood, still pointing. Daniel's heart pounded. Had he fallen into a different place? Or had the house always been this? A rustling sound broke the silence. He turned sharply toward the buried hand, only to see that it was no longer just a hand. A figure had emerged, half risen from the earth, its face hidden beneath a tattered veil of soil. And as it moved, as it took its first shuddering breath, Daniel felt something horrifyingly familiar about it. The whispers converged into one voice. One single, awful phrase, spoken in a rasping breath that sounded like his own. "You dug this grave." Daniel staggered back. No, that wasn't possible. He had never been here before. He had never buried anything. He tried to deny it, but the memories that weren't his began to surface. Shovels breaking the earth, sweat dripping down his face, the weight of something heavy in his arms, a name whispered over and over again. And then the veiled figure lifted its head. Daniel saw its face, and Daniel screamed. Daniel's scream barely left his throat before his breath was stolen by the sheer impossibility of what he was seeing. The veiled figure, now fully risen from the earth, was him. The face beneath the dirt-streaked veil was his own, pale, sunken dead. The same sharp jawline, the same deep-set eyes, but lifeless. His own corpse stood before him, staring back, its lips parted in a soundless whisper. Daniel staggered backward, his pulse hammering so violently he thought his heart might burst. This isn't real. This can't be real. He clenched his fists, digging his nails into his palm to ground himself. But the sensation of flesh against flesh only confirmed one horrifying truth. He was still here. The whispers around him grew deafening, a cacophony of voices overlapping, crashing into each other like a violent tide. Some were familiar, his father's voice, an old childhood friend, even the hushed tones of his own past conversations. But others were alien, voices from the void, murmuring things he wasn't supposed to understand. The corpse took a step forward. Dirt crumbled from its clothing, and as it moved, Daniel noticed something else. It wasn't alone. More figures were rising from the graves around him, their forms half buried, their arms reaching, stretching, clawing their way free from the earth. Some were faceless shadows. Others had eyes but no mouths, their expressions frozen in eternal screams. They were all looking at him. The staircase, the one familiar thing in this warped landscape, still stood behind him, leading up to the figure at the top. The shadowy being had not moved, but its presence bore down on him with growing intensity, as though it were watching, waiting for him to make a decision. Daniel had two choices. He could run, try to flee into the endless graveyard, risk losing himself in whatever nightmare dimension he had been thrust into, or he could go up those stairs, toward the thing that had been guiding him since the beginning. His instinct screamed for him to run, to bolt in the opposite direction, but something deep inside, something colder, more logical, told him that running would do nothing. There was no escape from this. With a shuddering breath, Daniel turned toward the staircase. The moment he did, the whispers ceased. The graveyard held its breath. The corpses froze. Even his own dead reflection stood still. One step, then another. Daniel began his ascent. Daniel climbed, his breath shallow, each step feeling like he was ascending deeper into something he couldn't comprehend. The wooden staircase stretched unnaturally, longer than it should have, its structure defying all logic. The farther he went, the more reality twisted around him. The graveyard below shrank into a sea of black, and the air grew dense, suffocating, as though he were moving through a space that did not want him there. The figure at the top remained motionless, still pointing, its face obscured by flickering shadows. But now, with every step, Daniel noticed details he hadn't before. The figure's outline shimmered, warping in and out of focus like a reflection on disturbed water. It wasn't standing on solid ground, it was floating. The whispering resumed, softer now, curling around him like smoke. The voices murmured names he didn't recognize, dates he couldn't place, fragments of stories that had nothing to do with him. Yet somehow, they felt connected. When Daniel was only a few steps away from the top, the figure moved. It tilted its head slowly, almost curiously, before lowering its outstretched arm. Daniel froze, gripping the stairs railing, his knuckles turning white. The figure was acknowledging him now. It had been waiting for him. Then, without warning, the final step beneath his foot vanished. Daniel's stomach lurched as he pitched forward, expecting to tumble into the abyss below. But instead of falling, he was pulled. A violent force yanked him through the darkness, through the figure, through the very fabric of the house itself. The world flipped inside out, and then silence. When Daniel's vision cleared, he was no longer on the stairs. He wasn't even in the graveyard. He was in a room, a dimly lit, windowless space stretched around him, the walls lined with towering bookshelves. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and something more acrid, something rotting. At the center of the room stood a single wooden chair, facing away from him. Daniel's body felt disconnected, like he wasn't fully inside himself. Every movement was sluggish, as though he were wading through water. He turned, his eyes scanning the endless bookshelves. Each spine was blank, yet he felt an overwhelming sense that he knew these books. The whispering returned, no longer fragmented but clear. A single voice now, deliberate and calm. "Do you remember, Daniel?" A cold chill ran through him. The voice wasn't coming from the room. It was inside his head. Slowly, he turned toward the chair. It was no longer empty. A figure sat there, its back to him. Not moving, not breathing, waiting. Daniel took a step forward, his throat tightening. He already knew what he would see when the chair turned, because he had been here before. Daniel stood frozen, staring at the unmoving figure in the chair. His mind screamed for him to step back, to leave this place, but his body betrayed him. He felt drawn forward, as if some unseen force were urging him to uncover the truth that lay just beyond his reach. The air in the room thickened, the shadows in the corners stretching unnaturally, pulsing like living things. The whispering voice that had spoken inside his head was silent now, yet its presence remained. It was watching. Swallowing hard, Daniel took another step. The wooden floor beneath him creaked, and at that sound, the figure in the chair shifted. A slight tilt of the head, a subtle movement of the fingers. It knew he was there. Daniel clenched his fists to stop his hands from trembling. His breath came shallow as he reached out, his fingers hovering over the back of the chair. He didn't want to do this, but at the same time, he knew there was no other choice. With a sharp inhale, he grabbed the chair and spun it around. The figure slumped forward. It was him, again. The same dead face he had seen in the graveyard. The same lifeless eyes. The same twisted expression of someone who had witnessed something they were never meant to see. But this time, something was different. The corpse of himself sitting in the chair wasn't fully dead. Its lips moved, but no sound came. Its hands twitched, as though trying to grasp onto something unseen. The body convulsed once, then twice, before its mouth wrenched open. A sound erupted. Not a scream, not a voice, but something else entirely. A memory. Suddenly, Daniel was no longer in the room. He was somewhere else, someone else. Flashes of places he had never been but somehow recognized. A country road at dusk, an old wooden bridge over a swamp, a small child staring at something unseen in the trees. He saw his own hands, younger, gripping a rope tied to something heavy, a shape sinking beneath dark water. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. Daniel was back in the room, gasping for breath, his hands shaking violently. The corpse in the chair had collapsed into dust. The voice returned, smooth and patient. "You buried it, but it never left." Daniel turned sharply, searching for the source, but there was no one else in the room. Only him. Only the bookshelves lined with his past. His head pounded. He didn't understand, but something inside him, something long buried, did. And now it was waking up. The words echoed through Daniel's mind, as if the room itself were a vast chamber that reflected nothing but his thoughts. "You buried it, but it never left." The voice had whispered those words so clearly, so deliberately, as if it were teaching him a truth he had long forgotten. A truth that was both his and not his at the same time. Daniel stumbled back, his legs weak beneath him. The room, the oppressive, windowless space, seemed to press in on him, the shelves now towering over him like some suffocating monument. Each book appeared to be alive with the weight of its contents, staring back at him. It was clear now. He had not simply stumbled upon this place by accident. This wasn't some supernatural trap that he had walked into without warning. This room, this house, these visions, they were connected to him. He was tied to them in ways he couldn't yet understand. As the truth began to settle like a weight in his stomach, a flicker of recognition ran through him. The images that had flashed before his eyes, the bridge, the child, the rope, they weren't just random pieces of a nightmare. He had seen them before. He had lived them. He had forgotten, buried them so deep in his mind that he had convinced himself that they were nothing but the product of some twisted imagination. But now they returned. He remembered the long drive with his father, the feeling of weightlessness as they crossed that same old bridge. He remembered the child, his younger brother, Tommy, standing by the water watching something in the trees. He had never understood why Tommy was drawn to that spot, why he had spent hours staring at the dark swamp beyond the bridge, his eyes wide and haunted. Daniel had always thought it was just a child's fantasy, something to do with the imagination of a boy too young to comprehend the danger that lingered in the swamp. But now, in the pit of his stomach, a cold, unshakable dread told him that he had been wrong. Tommy had known something. He had seen something, and it wasn't just a figment of his imagination. It was real. The room seemed to grow darker around him, and the shelves, once so imposing, now appeared as if they were closing in, pressing against his very soul. The past, the buried past, was not merely a memory. It was a presence, something alive, something that had been waiting for him to remember. Daniel's thoughts were interrupted by a faint sound, the faintest scrape, like something heavy dragging across the floor. He whipped around, but saw nothing. The chair, once filled with his own corpse, was now empty. The dust had settled around it, and yet the room felt more alive than it had before. More real, more present. He could feel the weight of the silence. It was thick, suffocating, as if the air itself were laden with the truth he was desperately trying to avoid. It was here in the silence that the answer would be found. Not in the books, not in the walls, but in the emptiness of the room. The voice returned, quiet and insistent. You can't bury it anymore. It's waiting for you. Daniel turned again, now panicked, looking for some escape, some way out. But he knew, deep down, that there was nowhere to go. This house, the graveyard, the swamp, they were all part of him, and he had to face what he had buried, no matter how much it terrified him. Slowly, with a sense of inevitability that he could not escape, Daniel began to walk toward the door at the far end of the room, the one he had not noticed until now. The walls closed in, the air thickened, and as he reached for the handle, he realized one crushing truth. He wasn't leaving. Not yet. He was only stepping deeper into his own darkness. As Daniel gripped the door handle, a sense of dread rolled over him like a wave. The cold metal felt oddly warm against his skin, as if it were absorbing the heat of his fear. He paused, his breath shallow, before twisting the knob. There was a brief moment of resistance, as though the door didn't want to open, but then it gave way with an unsettling creak. Beyond the door lay a hallway that stretched endlessly, an unfamiliar corridor that seemed to defy the laws of architecture. The walls were lined with mirrors, but not ordinary mirrors. These were old, tarnished, their glass warped, distorting reflections in grotesque and unsettling ways. It was as though each mirror held a fragment of a different reality, a world that wasn't quite right. Daniel stepped into the hallway, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet beneath him. The walls seemed to close in around him with every step, the mirrors reflecting not only his image but pieces of his past, distorted snapshots of his life, moments he had long forgotten. He saw his younger self standing with his father by the graveyard, the sky overcast and foreboding. He saw his mother's face, pale and tear-streaked, her eyes filled with a sadness that had never been explained. Each reflection was like a shard of glass, a splinter in his mind that he couldn't fully understand. The mirrors were alive, feeding off his confusion, his unease. They seemed to know him, to see parts of him that he had buried so deep he thought they were lost forever. The further he walked, the more distorted the images became. In one mirror, he saw himself, but with his face covered in blood. In another, he was drowning, sinking into the swamp's dark waters, his arms flailing as the murky depths swallowed him whole. The reflections grew more desperate, more violent, until Daniel could hardly recognize himself. The hallway seemed endless, yet as he walked, it began to feel familiar. He recognized the twisted architecture, the unnatural bends in the walls. He had been here before, or at least in a place like it. This was the house, the same house he had been trapped in since he first arrived. But now, the walls were shifting, morphing, as if they were alive, breathing in time with his pulse. His heart raced, and he found himself running, though he didn't know what he was running from. The mirrors seemed to stretch out in front of him, their reflections becoming more chaotic, as though they were reaching for him. He could hear the soft scrape of something moving just beyond the glass. Something watching, waiting. Then, in the farthest corner of the hallway, he saw something that stopped him in his tracks, a door. It was small, nondescript, almost hidden in the shadows. It was not like the other doors in the house, not like the one he had just opened. This one seemed different. It didn't belong. He couldn't explain why, but something inside him knew that this was where he needed to go. This was the way forward. The door seemed to beckon him, urging him to approach. But as Daniel moved closer, the mirrors began to distort more rapidly, and the reflections grew more violent. His reflection screamed at him. It pounded against the glass, its mouth opening wide, as if begging for help, as if begging him to understand. But Daniel couldn't stop. He reached out, his hand trembling as it hovered over the door's cold handle. This was it. He had come too far to turn back now. With a final, deep breath, he turned the knob and pushed the door open. On the other side, the world was waiting for him. The room on the other side of the door was unlike anything Daniel could have imagined. The air was thick with the scent of earth, damp and heavy, as if the very walls were made of soil. The floor was uneven, a dark, muddy substance creeping up the edges of the room, clinging to the walls like some ancient growth. The ceiling was low, almost oppressive, and from it hung strange, twisted vines that seemed to pulse with an unseen life. It felt as if the room itself were a living organism, its breath slow and rhythmic, echoing through the space like the sound of a heartbeat. Daniel stepped into the room cautiously, his senses on high alert. The door behind him slammed shut with a force that startled him, leaving him in near darkness. The only light came from the strange vines hanging from the ceiling, which emitted a faint, phosphorescent glow, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. For a moment, Daniel stood frozen, trying to process what he was seeing. It was as though he had stepped into another world, one where time and reality had no meaning. The silence in the room was suffocating, oppressive in a way that made Daniel feel like he couldn't breathe. He tried to move, but his feet felt as though they were glued to the floor. It wasn't the mud that held him in place, but something far more insidious, a force, invisible yet undeniable, that had wrapped itself around him the moment he entered the room. And then, from the shadows, came a sound, a whisper. Soft at first, like the rustling of leaves in a breeze, but gradually growing louder. A voice. It was low, guttural, and distorted, as if it came from the very bowels of the earth itself. The words were unintelligible at first, but then, like a distant memory rising from the depths of his mind, the voice grew clearer. "You should never have come back." The words hit Daniel like a punch to the gut, and for a moment he thought he might collapse. His heart pounded in his chest as he tried to make sense of the voice. It was so familiar, so intimate, but it couldn't be. He had heard that voice before, but it belonged to someone long gone. "Who are you?" Daniel managed to croak, his voice trembling. The response was a low, raspy laugh, one that reverberated through the walls, sending shivers down his spine. "You already know." Daniel felt the ground shift beneath his feet, the mud beneath him pulling as though the earth itself was alive. His gaze was drawn to the center of the room, where the vines hung thick and twisted. There, in the very heart of the room, was a figure, a shadow, indistinct but unmistakably human. The figure stood motionless, its back to him, facing the wall. Slowly, almost unwillingly, Daniel took a step forward. The closer he got to the figure, the more the air seemed to hum, vibrating with some unseen energy. The vines seemed to writhe in response to his movement, the room itself growing warmer, more oppressive. "You know what you've done, don't you?" The voice whispered again, this time from the figure, its tone full of malice and sorrow. The voice was unmistakably that of his mother, the voice from his past. His breath caught in his throat as recognition hit him like a tidal wave. It wasn't just his mother's voice, it was her. The figure turned slowly, and though its features were obscured by the shadows, Daniel felt a sense of dread overwhelm him. The face that stared back at him was a contorted mockery of the woman he had known, her eyes wide with an impossible grief, her mouth stretched in a grin that was both grotesque and sorrowful. "You," the figure whispered, its voice now sharp with accusation. "You let him die." The words stung, cutting deep into his soul. Tommy. The memory came crashing back, unbidden and unforgiving. It had been Daniel's fault. He had let Tommy go to the swamp that day, had let him play by the water's edge. And now, here in this room, in this nightmarish reality, the past had returned, more vivid and more terrifying than ever before. For the first time, Daniel understood. The house, the swamp, the reflections in the mirrors, they were all part of something far darker. The past had never left him. It had been waiting, patient, until it could rise again. The entity that haunted this house, that haunted his memories, had always been there. And now, it was demanding to be seen. The figure stepped forward, its presence consuming the space around Daniel. His body trembled as he tried to move, but the force in the room held him in place. His mind raced, his pulse quickened. He had no escape, no refuge. The walls were closing in, and all he could do was stare at the figure, the embodiment of his guilt. "You can never escape what you've done, Daniel." The voice rasped once more, its tone a twisted blend of sorrow and finality. "You will never leave this place. Not now. Not ever." And in that moment, Daniel realized the house had always known his name. It had always known what he had done. Daniel's mind raced as he stood in the heart of the room, feeling both trapped and paralyzed. The shadowy figure before him, a twisted version of his mother, seemed to pull at the very fabric of his reality. It was as though he was caught in a never-ending loop, stuck in a moment of time that he could neither escape nor understand. The room, the vines, the voice, it was all part of something much larger, something far more sinister. And as the figure's grotesque face lingered in his vision, Daniel's thoughts spiraled, each moment more intense than the last. How had he arrived here? How had his life led him to this point? The oppressive weight of guilt bore down on him with crushing force. The memory of Tommy's death, of that fateful day by the swamp, replayed over and over in his mind, each repetition stripping away the final threads of his sanity. He had failed to save Tommy. He had failed to prevent the accident, to keep him from drowning in the murky waters. And now, standing before this monstrous reflection of his mother, he could no longer deny the truth. He was the one who had brought this upon himself. The figure took another step toward him, its outstretched hands reaching for him as though to pull him into the darkness that surrounded them both. But in that moment, something shifted. A subtle vibration hummed through the air, the walls seeming to ripple with the pulse of an unseen force. It was as if the very house was responding to the figure's presence, feeding off the emotions that coursed through Daniel's veins. The vines overhead swayed in response, their glow dimming and flickering like the last breath of a dying fire. "Leave," the figure whispered again, its voice soft and haunting, a melody of sorrow and desperation. But it wasn't just a voice. It was a command, a plea. The walls seemed to lean in closer, as though they too were waiting for Daniel to make a decision. And as he stood there, paralyzed, he realized that this moment, this room, was not a punishment. It was a test. The house had been playing a game with him since the beginning, pulling him deeper into its labyrinthine corridors of the past, feeding on his fears, his regrets. It wasn't just his memories that haunted this place. It was his unresolved guilt. The swamp outside, the drowning of Tommy, the years of denial. It all formed a tangled knot that had now, impossibly, pulled him back into this place. This place of reckoning. Daniel closed his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest, and tried to breathe through the suffocating air. He couldn't fight it anymore. He couldn't fight the house, the figure, or the truth that lay at the heart of his torment. But there was one thing left that he still had control over. One decision that could either free him or condemn him forever. The swamp. He had to go back. He had avoided it for so long, buried it deep within him. But the swamp had always been there, its dark waters lurking just outside the house. It was the place where everything had gone wrong, the place where his life had shifted on its axis, never to return to the way it was before. The memories of that day by the water, of Tommy's lifeless body, had never left him. And now, he could no longer ignore the call of the swamp. Opening his eyes, Daniel turned his gaze back to the figure. It was no longer just an embodiment of guilt. It was a manifestation of his own soul, a reflection of everything he had refused to confront. The house had shown him his past, but it was up to him to decide what to do with it. He had to confront the swamp. As if sensing his resolve, the figure stepped back, its arms falling to its sides, its twisted form growing more insubstantial with each passing second. The air lightened, the oppressive weight lifting, but the silence that filled the room was deafening. The house was waiting for him to move, to make his choice. Daniel turned toward the door, the path to the swamp lying just beyond. The room had returned to its unnatural stillness, but he knew that stepping outside would not bring peace. There was no peace to be found here, not yet. But maybe, just maybe, if he faced the swamp once more, he could find some way to end this cycle. He didn't know what awaited him outside. Perhaps it would be the answers he so desperately sought, or perhaps it would be more of the same twisted game the house had played with him from the start. But one thing was certain, he had no choice. The swamp was calling him back, and he would answer. The moment Daniel stepped outside, he was met with the cold, biting air that hung heavy around the house, thick with the scent of wet earth and decay. The swamp, which he had been trying to ignore for so long, stretched before him like an ancient beast lying in wait. Its dark, sluggish waters mirrored the night sky, shrouded in mist and silence. The oppressive weight of the swamp seemed to press down on him, suffocating in its familiarity, in its history. He had left this place behind so many years ago, convinced that distance and time would allow him to forget. But the truth was undeniable. The swamp had always been with him, buried deep within the recesses of his mind. The house had only called him back to finish what had started there, at the water's edge. Daniel stood at the edge of the swamp, his feet sinking slightly into the mud as he took in the landscape before him. The trees that once had seemed so distant were now looming ominously, their bare branches stretching toward him like twisted fingers, reaching for something he couldn't quite comprehend. The water lapped quietly against the shore, its ripples barely disturbing the surface. The sounds of the night, distant hoots of owls, the occasional rustling of unseen creatures, were muffled by the thick air that clung to everything, leaving the entire scene wrapped in an eerie stillness. It was as if time itself had been suspended in this place, frozen in a moment that never truly ended. As he ventured deeper into the swamp, the mud clung to his boots, dragging at him with every step. His mind was filled with memories, fragments of that day, flashes of Tommy's laughter, the carefree moments before the world had crumbled. But those memories quickly turned dark, distorted by the memory of the drowning, of the helplessness that had consumed him when he realized he couldn't save his brother. He had stood at the water's edge, paralyzed by fear, unable to move, unable to think, as Tommy had struggled in the murky depths. The guilt washed over him like the cold water that had taken Tommy's life. It was suffocating, all-consuming, and it had followed him ever since. The path grew more treacherous as he moved closer to the heart of the swamp. The trees grew denser, their trunks gnarled and twisted, their roots emerging from the ground like ancient veins, threatening to trip him with every step. Yet there was a strange pull, a force that seemed to guide him, urging him onward. The further he went, the more his heart raced, as though he were being drawn towards something, toward a confrontation he had been avoiding for far too long. Then he saw it, the small clearing by the water's edge where Tommy had drowned all those years ago. It was eerily familiar, and yet somehow it felt like an entirely different place. The clearing was no longer just a patch of land. It was an open wound, a scar in the landscape that was both part of him and separate from him. The water, which had once seemed so still and harmless, now rippled ominously, its depths dark and unknown. The memory of Tommy's face, pale and lifeless, flashed in his mind, and he felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he stood at the edge of the water. The house, the figure, the vines, they had all led him here to this very moment. The swamp had been waiting for him, just as it had waited for Tommy. There was no escape, no running from the past. The water was a mirror, reflecting not just the landscape, but everything he had tried to bury. It was an invitation, an open call to confront the truth. Without thinking, Daniel stepped forward, his foot sinking into the cold, muddy water. The sensation was jarring, as though the water itself was reaching up to claim him, pulling at him with unseen hands. The water lapped at his legs, colder than he had remembered, sending a chill through his bones. He waded deeper, his body tense, his mind racing with the weight of the decision he had made. Each step felt like a journey deeper into his own psyche, into the very heart of his guilt and regret. As he reached the center of the clearing, the water rose higher, the swamp seeming to react to his presence. The air grew thicker, heavier, as if the swamp itself were holding its breath. And then, a voice broke the silence, a whisper that sent a shiver down his spine. It wasn't the figure from the house, but something else, something older, something more primal. The voice came from the very water, from the depths of the swamp itself. "You cannot undo what has been done." Daniel's heart stuttered. The words were not just a statement. They were a truth, a reality that he could not escape. He had tried to outrun his guilt for so long, but now, standing in the very heart of the swamp, he realized that it would always follow him. The past could not be undone. He could not save Tommy. He could not change what had happened. But perhaps, just perhaps, he could find a way to live with it. The water around him began to swirl, the surface churning as though reacting to his thoughts. Daniel closed his eyes, bracing himself for whatever came next. He didn't know what awaited him in the depths, but he knew one thing for certain. The swamp was no longer just a place. It was a part of him, and if he was ever going to find peace, he would have to face it, no matter the cost. Daniel stood frozen in the murky water, the oppressive silence of the swamp closing in around him. The whisper, the voice that seemed to emanate from the very depths of the water, had shaken him to his core. It was not just a voice. It was an echo, a reflection of the guilt he had carried with him for all these years. In that instant, he understood that the swamp was not simply a place. It was a living entity, a conduit for the past that had never truly left him. As the water swirled around his legs, he felt an overwhelming sense of inevitability. It was as if the swamp itself had been waiting for him, drawing him back to confront what he had buried so deep within himself. He thought back to the days before Tommy's death, before the accident that had torn their family apart. The memories were sharp, vivid, moments of carefree laughter, of shared adventures, of promises made. Tommy had been everything to him, his closest friend, his brother in every sense of the word. They had been inseparable, bonded by a love that went beyond family. But those days, those innocent moments, were now stained with the brutal reality of what had happened at this very spot. The guilt, the shame, he couldn't escape it. The voice, the water, the swirling mist. It all felt like a manifestation of his regret. The memories of that day, the day Tommy had died, began to flood his mind in a rush. It had been a typical afternoon. The two of them had been playing near the water, as they often did, daring each other to jump into the swamp's dark depths. But that day was different. That day, Tommy had slipped. Daniel had watched, paralyzed, as his brother struggled in the water, gasping for air. He had reached out, but it had been too late. The swamp had claimed Tommy, pulling him under with a force that Daniel couldn't understand or fight against. The sound of Tommy's cries, the desperate thrashing, echoed in his ears. He had failed. The guilt had consumed him ever since. As he stood there now, in the very place where Tommy had drowned, the weight of his failure felt unbearable. The swamp, which had always been so familiar, now felt like a suffocating presence, as if it were closing in on him, forcing him to confront his past. The water around his legs seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, almost alive, as though it were drawing him further into its depths. He could feel his heart pounding in his chest, the pressure building with every passing second. He wanted to run, to escape, but something inside him urged him to stay, to face the past, to face the truth. "You cannot run from what you have done," the voice whispered again, this time clearer, more insistent. It was not a threat, but a simple statement of fact. Daniel closed his eyes, trying to block out the words, but they seemed to resonate within him. There was no denying it anymore. The past was here, in this very moment. The swamp had not only witnessed Tommy's death, it had witnessed his own. The man he had become, the years of guilt and self-loathing, all of it had been forged in this place. He thought of his life since that day. The years he had spent trying to forget, trying to outrun the pain. He had left the house, the swamp, the town. He had built a life for himself, away from the memories that haunted him. But no matter where he went, no matter how far he ran, the guilt had never loosened its grip. It had shaped his relationships, his choices, even his very sense of self. He had never allowed himself to truly heal, to forgive himself. The weight of his failure had been too great, too overwhelming. Now, standing in the heart of the swamp, Daniel realized that there was no escape. He had spent his life avoiding the truth, but the swamp was reminding him that it would never let him forget. The past was alive, echoing in the water, in the trees, in the very air he breathed. And no matter how much time had passed, it would always be with him. A strange sense of calm began to wash over him, a realization that the only way to move forward was to confront the past head-on. The guilt, the shame, they would never disappear. But perhaps, in facing it, he could find a way to live with it, to accept it. Tommy's death was not something he could undo, but he could choose how he let it define him. He could choose to honor his brother's memory, not by wallowing in regret, but by moving forward with the understanding that he was not defined by his mistakes. The water around him seemed to still, the swirling motion calming, as if the swamp was listening, acknowledging his decision. The voice, now quieter, seemed to recede, leaving behind only the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. For the first time in years, Daniel felt a flicker of something other than guilt, a sense of hope, however small, that perhaps there was a way to find peace in the wreckage of his past. It would not be easy. The swamp would always be there, a reminder of what he had lost. But now, he understood that it did not have to be a prison. It could be a place of healing, a place where the past and the present could coexist. With a final look at the dark waters, Daniel turned and made his way back toward the house. His footsteps were steady now, his mind clearer than it had been in years. The swamp would always be a part of him, but it no longer held the power to consume him. He had taken the first step toward reclaiming his life, toward finding a way to live with the past without allowing it to define him. And for the first time in a long time, Daniel felt the weight on his shoulders lighten, if only just a little. The journey ahead was uncertain, but he was ready to face it, whatever it might bring. The days that followed Daniel's moment of clarity at the swamp were both surreal and unsettling. There was something different in the air, a heaviness that he couldn't quite shake off. He had finally acknowledged his guilt, accepted the fact that Tommy's death was an event forever etched in his past, but now he was faced with the haunting realization that the house itself was unwilling to let go. The very walls seemed to hold memories, memories that he had long since buried deep within himself, memories he wasn't sure he was ready to confront. The house, a place of both refuge and torment, was now a prison of sorts. The creaking floorboards, the faint whispers in the corners of his mind, and the eerie drafts that always seemed to blow at night. It was as though the house had become an extension of the swamp, a manifestation of the unresolved pain that lingered within Daniel. It was a place where time stood still, where the past constantly bled into the present, and where every room seemed to carry a trace of Tommy's spirit. Daniel could feel the weight of those memories pressing down on him, especially in the quiet moments when he was left alone with his thoughts. The house, once a place of safety, had turned into a reflection of his own inner turmoil. Each room felt like a tomb of forgotten emotions. The kitchen, where he and Tommy had shared countless meals and laughter, now felt cold and unwelcoming. The living room, where they had spent hours watching TV together, seemed to echo with the silence of what was lost. And the staircase that led up to the attic. He could almost hear Tommy's footsteps, feel his presence, but when he looked, there was nothing. As he moved through the house, Daniel couldn't help but notice the subtle changes. The walls, once clean and bright, now seemed to have darkened with age. The windows, which had once allowed the sunlight to flood the rooms, were now shrouded in a dim, oppressive gloom. It was as if the house itself had taken on the burden of the past, and in doing so, had begun to crumble under the weight of it. The place was falling apart, much like his own sense of self. But it wasn't just the house that had changed. Daniel, too, was different. He had hoped that by confronting the past, he could somehow move beyond it, but instead, he found himself drawn further into the labyrinth of his own memories. The guilt that had once been a silent, almost abstract feeling had now become an active presence, manifesting itself in strange ways. He would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, convinced that he had heard someone calling his name. He would hear footsteps echoing through the house, only to find that no one was there. The sensation of being watched was constant, as if Tommy's spirit was lingering just out of sight, waiting to be acknowledged. One evening, as Daniel sat in the living room, trying to distract himself with a book, he felt it again, the unmistakable sensation that someone was in the room with him. His skin crawled, and his heart skipped a beat. Slowly, he turned his head toward the hallway, but there was nothing there. He stood up, his legs trembling slightly, and made his way to the kitchen. The house was quiet, too quiet. The silence seemed to grow louder, filling every corner of the room. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And then, in the distance, he heard it, the faintest whisper of a voice, too soft to be real, but undeniably there. It sounded like Tommy's voice, calling him, "Daniel, come back." The words sent a chill down his spine, and for a moment he felt his resolve begin to crumble. The voice was unmistakable, the same voice he had heard so many times in his childhood. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just a memory. It was as if Tommy was calling him from the other side, urging him to do something, to face something he wasn't ready for. The house seemed to shift around him, its walls closing in, the air thick with the scent of decay. The flickering light from the kitchen cast long shadows across the room, making the space feel even more oppressive. Daniel's pulse quickened as he tried to make sense of what was happening. Had he finally lost his mind? Or was this something deeper, something beyond explanation? He didn't know, but the feeling of being trapped was unmistakable. The whisper came again, louder this time, and Daniel found himself compelled to follow it. He walked down the hallway, each step feeling heavier than the last. He reached the staircase that led up to the attic, and the whisper grew more insistent, more urgent. "Daniel, up here." The voice was no longer just Tommy's. It was something else, something darker, something ancient. The hair on the back of Daniel's neck stood on end as he hesitated at the bottom of the stairs. Something was waiting for him in the attic. Something tied to the house, to the swamp, and to the truth he had long since tried to forget. The memories he had buried, the guilt he had refused to face. It was all coming to the surface, demanding to be acknowledged. With a deep breath, Daniel made his way up the stairs. The air grew colder with each step, the whisper growing louder, until it felt like a deafening roar in his ears. He reached the top of the stairs, and as he opened the attic door, he was met with an overwhelming sense of dread. The room was empty, save for the dust-covered furniture and old, forgotten belongings. But as Daniel stepped inside, he felt it, the unmistakable presence of something watching him. The walls seemed to close in, and the floor creaked under his weight. There, in the far corner of the room, he saw it, a small, wooden chest, weathered with age. The chest had always been there, he realized, tucked away in the attic for as long as he could remember. But now, in the dim light, it seemed different, darker, more foreboding. The whisper came once more, now more than just a voice. It was a command. "Open it." With trembling hands, Daniel approached the chest. The air around him felt thick, oppressive, as if the house itself was holding its breath. He reached for the latch, and with a loud creak, the chest opened. Inside, there was a collection of old photographs, yellowed with age. Daniel's heart skipped a beat as he sifted through the pictures. The faces of his family stared back at him. His parents, Tommy, but there, hidden among the photographs, was something else. A picture of the house itself, but from a time long before he had ever lived there. The house, in its pristine condition, stood tall and proud, surrounded by a thick, unnatural fog. And beneath that photograph, a letter written in a handwriting that Daniel recognized but could not place. As he unfolded the letter, a chill ran through him. The message was short, but it carried a weight that was impossible to ignore. The house remembers. The swamp remembers. You cannot escape what has been forgotten. And with that, Daniel understood. The house had never been just a home. It had always been a keeper of secrets. Secrets that had been buried long before he had ever set foot inside. And now, those secrets were beginning to surface. The past was not done with him. It was only just beginning. The weight of the letter in Daniel's hands felt heavier with each passing moment. The words, "The house remembers," "The swamp remembers," "You cannot escape what has been forgotten," echoed in his mind, their meaning unfurling like a dark, suffocating fog. The realization settled over him that whatever had been buried within these walls, within this house, was now impossible to escape. The house, much like his own fractured mind, had been a silent keeper of secrets, waiting patiently for the right moment to unveil its truth. It was clear now. Daniel had walked into something far larger than he had anticipated. The past was not just a series of disconnected events. It was an entity, alive and restless, waiting to be acknowledged. For years, Daniel had told himself that the house was just a house. It had been passed down through generations, a seemingly innocuous family heirloom, nestled in the middle of nowhere. The swamp had always been there, an ominous backdrop that seemed more a part of the landscape than something he needed to concern himself with. But now, in the quiet solitude of the attic, Daniel could feel it. The deep, pervasive pull of something ancient, something that had been buried long before his own existence. As the evening wore on, Daniel found himself staring at the chest in front of him, the pictures scattered across the floor. He reached for one photograph in particular, a picture of the house, old and decrepit, standing tall amidst a fog so thick it obscured the surrounding trees. The image seemed frozen in time, yet it felt like it was pulsing, alive, as if it held the key to everything Daniel was struggling to understand. Who had taken this photograph? Why had it been hidden in the chest all these years? And what did it have to do with Tommy? His mind raced, memories flashing back like a reel of film, too fast to comprehend. He remembered the first time he set foot in this house, so many years ago, when he had been a child. Back then, it had been a place of comfort, a place where the world seemed far away and time stood still. But now, everything had changed. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a trap. And the swamp, it was no longer just a piece of the landscape. It was a force, a presence that seeped into everything, drawing its strength from the secrets buried within the earth. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that there was something beneath the surface of the swamp, something deeper than the water, deeper than the earth itself. It was as if the swamp held the memories of those who had come before him. And now, those memories were beginning to surface. And in the silence of the house, the whispers that had once been faint, indistinct murmurs now grew louder, more insistent. They came from all directions, whispers in the corners of his mind, whispers that echoed through the empty halls. He had to know the truth. He had to understand what had happened here, in this house, in this place. But as he stared at the photograph, a strange unease filled him. What if he wasn't ready for the truth? What if it was more than he could bear? The door to the attic creaked open, and Daniel froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He hadn't heard anyone approach. Yet, as he turned, there was no one there, just the darkness of the hallway beyond. The house seemed to breathe around him, its walls shifting, pulsing with an energy he couldn't explain. He stood there for a moment, unsure of whether he should leave the attic or stay. Something told him that the answers lay in the attic, but something else, something darker, warned him not to venture too deep. As if in response to his indecision, a faint sound reached his ears, barely audible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was a soft scratching like nails against wood coming from behind the wall. It wasn't just the house settling. It was something more, something deliberate. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the sound continued, growing louder and more frantic, as if something was trying to break free from its confines. The walls seemed to shift, and the air around him grew thick with a sense of foreboding. The house was alive, in a way he couldn't comprehend, as if it had its own consciousness, its own desires. It wasn't just a house, it was a vessel, a container for something that had been trapped for far too long. Daniel had been so focused on the house, on the memories it contained, that he hadn't stopped to consider what had happened to the people who had come before him. His ancestors, his family. Had they known what lay beneath the surface of the swamp? Had they been complicit in whatever darkness lingered there? The scratching stopped, and for a moment, everything was still. But the silence was suffocating, pressing in on him from all sides. It was as though the house was waiting, holding its breath, for him to make the next move. The feeling of being watched returned, stronger than ever. The air felt thick, charged with an energy that pulsed through the walls like electricity. Daniel's hands shook as he reached for the photograph again, his eyes scanning the image once more. In the distance, barely visible through the fog, he noticed something that hadn't caught his attention before. A figure standing by the edge of the swamp. It was too blurry to make out any details, but it was unmistakably human. And as his eyes lingered on the photograph, the figure seemed to move, shifting just slightly, as if it was aware of him. The realization hit him like a wave. This wasn't just a photograph. It was a warning. The scratching returned, louder this time, more urgent. It was coming from the floorboards beneath him, from the very foundation of the house itself. Without thinking, Daniel dropped the photograph and rushed to the attic floor, his mind consumed with the need to escape. The house, once a place of memories, had now become a prison, and it was no longer willing to let him go. As he reached for the door, the whisper returned, louder than ever. "You can't escape. You never could." The walls seemed to close in on him, the darkness swallowing him whole. There was no way out, no escape from the house, from the swamp, from the truth that had been buried for so long. Daniel realized with a sinking feeling that the house had always been his cage. And now, there was no turning back. The night that followed was heavier than any before it, an oppressive stillness that blanketed the house. Daniel's mind raced with the memory of the whispers, the scratching, the photograph. Everything had converged into a singular, terrifying realization. The house had not been empty of life, nor had it simply housed his family. It was a living entity, one that had been feeding on something far deeper than the bloodline of his ancestors. As the walls seemed to breathe around him, Daniel could no longer deny the truth. He had unwittingly walked into something far greater, far darker than anything he had anticipated. He had always felt the house was alive in a metaphorical sense. The creaks of the floorboards, the flickering of lights, the wind howling through cracks in the old wooden frame. It was easy to dismiss such things as the effects of age. But now, after everything he had seen and felt, it became clear the house was not a mere structure. It was a keeper of memories, a silent witness to horrors past. And it wasn't content with just remembering. It needed to reveal those memories, to force them back to the surface. Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that he was being tested, as though the house was forcing him to uncover something crucial, something hidden in the very bones of the place. His mind kept returning to that photograph, the figure standing at the edge of the swamp. Who was that person? Was it someone from the past, someone tied to the house? Or was it something more, something that defied the simple logic of human existence? The questions gnawed at him, relentless and unforgiving. The next morning, Daniel ventured outside, drawn by an inexplicable urge to explore the edge of the swamp. He couldn't explain it, but he felt a compulsion to return to the site of that photograph, as if it were the key to unlocking the mysteries that had taken root in his mind. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the property, but it did little to lift the oppressive weight that seemed to follow him wherever he went. The air was thick with humidity, the smell of the swamp heavy and sour, and every step he took felt deliberate, as if the ground beneath him was absorbing his presence, marking him as its own. As Daniel reached the edge of the swamp, he could see nothing out of the ordinary. The same dense fog lingered, the The same still waters stretched out before him. Yet there was something undeniably wrong. The air felt colder here, the ground beneath his feet soft and treacherous, as if the earth itself was shifting with some unspoken purpose. He stood at the water's edge for a moment, staring out at the endless expanse of murky water, unsure of what he was waiting for. It was then that he heard it, the softest of sounds, a faint rustling in the distance. It was impossible to tell if it came from the swamp or the house itself, but it was enough to make his heart race. He stepped closer to the water, straining his ears, trying to make sense of the noise. Was it a bird? A creature of the swamp? Or was it something more? The possibility that it could be the figure from the photograph flashed in his mind, and with it, a wave of dread swept over him. He turned back toward the house, the urge to leave the swamp growing stronger with each passing second. But as he moved, he noticed something strange. The fog, which had always lingered near the water, seemed to be shifting, creeping toward the house itself, as though it was following him. The sensation was so palpable, so eerie, that Daniel stopped dead in his tracks. For the first time, he felt truly trapped, not by the house or the swamp, but by something far more insidious. Something was watching him. Something had been watching him since he first arrived, and now it was moving toward him. The path back to the house seemed longer than it had the day before, and with every step he took, the fog seemed to grow thicker, pressing in on him from all sides. His heart pounded in his chest, and the whispers returned, faint at first, then growing louder with each passing moment. "You cannot escape," they whispered. "You are here because you belong here." Daniel's breath caught in his throat as the realization hit him. The house, the swamp, it wasn't a place where he was an intruder. It was a place that had been waiting for him, pulling him back into its fold. The land, the very earth beneath him, had been calling to him long before he had ever stepped foot on it. His family had been part of this cycle for generations, each one drawn in by the same pull, each one contributing to the dark energy that had infected the land. But why? Why him? Why now? As he approached the house, he stopped once again, transfixed by something in the distance. The figure from the photograph was standing by the window of the attic, just as it had been captured in the image, standing still, staring out into the swamp. Daniel felt a chill run down his spine. It was not just a photograph. It was a record, a manifestation of something that was watching, waiting. This figure wasn't dead. It was a presence, one that was bound to the house, bound to the land. Daniel stood frozen, torn between his instinct to run and his need to confront the truth. He knew, deep down, that there was no escape. Not anymore. The house had already made its decision. It had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. And now, as the fog rolled in, it was only a matter of time before the truth would come to light. The house was not a place of shelter. It was a tomb, a waiting ground for the souls that had been drawn into its depths. As Daniel stepped closer to the door, the whispers seemed to come from every direction, louder and clearer now. "You are one of us," they said, their voices no longer just a murmur, but a chorus. "You belong here, and you will never leave." With a final, resigned breath, Daniel opened the door to the house, knowing that there was no turning back. The house was alive, and it had been waiting for him. The swamp had been waiting too. And now, together, they would reveal the truth. A truth buried long before his time, but one that was ready to surface at last. When Daniel stepped inside the house, the air was different. It was as if the walls themselves were breathing, a steady rise and fall, as if the house had become one with the land, with the swamp that surrounded it. The door shut behind him with a finality that sent a shiver down his spine, the echoes of its closing lingering in the empty space like the last breath of a dying man. The whispers had intensified as he crossed the threshold, surrounding him now like a swarm of bees, buzzing in his ears, murmuring incomprehensible things that made his head spin. It was as though the house itself was alive, reaching out to him, touching his mind with the cold fingers of something ancient, something malevolent. The temperature inside had dropped, and Daniel could see his breath in the air as he walked deeper into the house. The floor creaked beneath his feet, the sound oddly comforting, as though it was welcoming him back. The walls, once pristine, were now covered in a thick layer of dust and grime, and the faded wallpaper peeled away in places, revealing dark stains underneath. The house had been abandoned for years, but it felt as though it had been waiting for him, for this very moment. As he moved further into the house, the whispers grew louder, their words clearer, more insistent. "It's too late. You cannot undo what has been done. The house is yours now. It owns you." Daniel's heart raced, but he pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. He knew that he had come here for a reason, even if he still didn't fully understand what that reason was. The house held the key to everything: his family's past, the strange pull that had brought him back, and the figure in the photograph. He made his way to the staircase, its wooden steps creaking under his weight. The house seemed to be holding its breath as he ascended, each step a calculated motion, as if the very structure of the house was aware of his every move. When he reached the top of the stairs, he paused, staring down the long, dimly lit hallway. The air felt heavier here, thicker with the same oppressive presence that had followed him since he first set foot on the property. It was as if the house was trying to swallow him whole. At the end of the hallway stood a door, slightly ajar, with a faint light emanating from the crack. The whispers were now a constant presence in his mind, growing louder with each passing second. "Go through the door," they urged. "It's where it all began. It's where it will end." Without fully understanding why, Daniel found himself moving toward the door, his hand trembling as he reached for the handle. The moment he touched it, the temperature in the house seemed to plummet further, and for a moment, he wondered if he had made a mistake. But the pull was irresistible, stronger than any fear he felt. He pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The light was dim, but it was enough to make out the shapes of old furniture, covered in dusty sheets, and the unmistakable scent of decay. But what caught his attention immediately was the large mirror that stood against the far wall. It was framed in dark wood, intricately carved with patterns he couldn't quite make out, and it seemed to pulse with an eerie, otherworldly energy. He moved toward it, drawn to it, unable to resist. As he stood before the mirror, he felt a strange sensation wash over him, as though he was no longer in the room, no longer in the house, but somewhere else entirely. The whispers had stopped, replaced by a silence that was deafening. In the mirror, Daniel saw not his own reflection, but the figure from the photograph. The same man standing in the same spot by the swamp, staring out with empty eyes. But this time the figure was different. His eyes were no longer vacant. They were filled with a burning intensity, and they were looking directly at Daniel. For a moment, Daniel froze, his body paralyzed by the sheer terror of it. The figure in the mirror slowly raised a hand and pointed directly at him. It was a gesture that seemed to reach into his very soul, pulling something from deep within him that he couldn't name. The house seemed to react to this, as though the mirror had unleashed something within it. The walls groaned, and the floor shook beneath his feet. He stumbled backward, his heart pounding, but he couldn't look away from the mirror. The figure in the glass began to move, stepping closer, its form becoming more solid, more real. Daniel's pulse quickened, his mind racing with the knowledge that he was no longer alone in this house, and that whatever force had been lurking in the shadows had finally revealed itself. The figure in the mirror spoke, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "You think you can escape? You think you can leave? This house, this land, it has claimed you. You are no different than the others. You belong to it now." The words echoed in his mind, reverberating with a truth he couldn't deny. The figure in the mirror was him, or at least it was something that had once been him. It was a part of the house's history, a part of the darkness that had festered within it for so long. And now, it was part of him too. Daniel staggered back, his breath coming in short gasps. The room around him seemed to shift, the walls warping and distorting, as if the very fabric of reality was beginning to unravel. The house was no longer just a house. It was something far more sinister, something that had been waiting for him, something that had drawn him in with an invisible hand. The whispers returned, louder now, filling his mind with a single, overwhelming thought. There was no escape. The house had claimed him, just as it had claimed so many before him. The figure in the mirror was a reminder of that truth, a truth that Daniel could no longer ignore. He was part of the house now, and no matter how hard he fought, no matter how far he ran, there was nowhere to hide. The past had caught up with him, and there was no escaping the darkness that had been building for generations. As the house seemed to close in around him, Daniel's final thought was not of fear, but of acceptance. He had been chosen, just as his ancestors had been chosen before him. The house had claimed its next victim, and there was no going back. The morning light broke through the heavy fog that had shrouded the swamp in a blanket of mist. From the outside, the house appeared unchanged, still decaying, still abandoned, still tethered to the land. But Daniel knew better. He had lived within its walls now, felt the pulse of its dark energy coursing through him. The house had claimed him, and he was no longer an observer, no longer a visitor. He was a part of it. His body, once a separate entity, had been swallowed up by the house, merging with its history, its secrets, and its horrors. The house had never been just a structure. It was an extension of the land itself. The swamp had always been its foundation, its heart, and now Daniel understood that connection fully. The land had a voice, a will, and it had been whispering to him, guiding him all along, leading him toward a destiny that he could not escape. He had thought he could break free, that he could uncover the truth and somehow escape its grasp. But now, standing in the cold, oppressive silence of the house, he knew the truth. There was no escape. The swamp had claimed him, and in doing so, so too had the house. The house's grip on his mind had become inescapable. Memories, fragmented and jumbled, seemed to swirl around him, crashing together like waves against a shore. Faces blurred together, both familiar and foreign, each one a reflection of the past, a piece of the house's endless history. Some were his ancestors, figures from the photograph, people whose lives had been intertwined with the swamp, with the land, with the darkness. Others were strangers, lost souls who had wandered into the house over the years, all claiming their own piece of it, becoming part of the house's haunting tapestry. It didn't matter who they were. They were all the same now, part of the house, part of the darkness. Daniel stood in the center of the house, the weight of its history pressing down on him. The walls were no longer just walls. They were the memory of those who had come before him. The floors, the ceiling, even the air itself, carried the echoes of lives lived and lost, of sacrifices made and promises broken. And in the center of it all stood the mirror. The same mirror that had shown him the figure from the past, the one that had called out to him in his dreams. It was no longer just a reflection of himself. It had become a window into the past, a portal to everything that had led him here. The mirror had changed in the time since Daniel had first seen it. It was no longer a simple reflection of his face, but a warped, contorted version of himself, one that twisted and bent as though it had a life of its own. The figure in the mirror, his own reflection, was no longer just an observer. It was him. The figure moved independently, as if it were a separate entity, a dark twin of Daniel, one that represented everything he had tried to avoid, everything he had hoped to outrun. It was the embodiment of the house's hold on him, the final manifestation of his fate. His breath came in shallow gasps as he watched the reflection in the mirror, unable to look away. The figure smiled at him, a twisted, knowing grin that chilled him to the bone. "You thought you could escape," the reflection spoke, its voice distorted, echoing in his mind. "You thought you could uncover the truth and walk away. But the truth is this: you were always meant to be here. You are part of the house now, just as they were, just as we all are." Daniel's hands shook as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the surface of the mirror. The glass was cold, unnaturally so, and as he made contact, a surge of energy coursed through him, a violent jolt that sent him stumbling backward. The house seemed to respond to this touch, as though it had awakened to his presence, recognizing him as one of its own. The walls groaned, the floor creaked, and for a moment, the air was thick with a suffocating force that pressed down on him from all sides. The house had been waiting for him. It had drawn him back, lured him in with the promise of answers. only to trap him in its dark embrace. And now, as the mirror shattered, splintering into 1,000 jagged pieces, Daniel understood the true horror. The house was not just a place. It was a being, a creature of sorts, and it had been alive all along. It had grown, fed, and evolved with each soul it claimed, each person it consumed. And Daniel was the next chapter in its story, the next soul to be absorbed into its depths. As the mirror shattered, the house seemed to pulse with life, a living, breathing entity that thrummed with an ancient power. The room around him blurred and twisted, the walls stretching and contracting as though they were made of flesh, not stone. The voices, the whispers, grew louder, overwhelming him with their unrelenting force. "You are one of us now," they said. "You cannot leave. You belong to the house, to the land, to the swamp." Daniel collapsed to his knees, his head spinning, as the realization sank in. The house had won. There was no escape, no way out. He had been consumed by its power, just as all who had come before him had been. The darkness had claimed him, and now he would become part of its endless cycle, a part of the house's living memory. His past, his future, it no longer mattered. He was no longer Daniel. He was the house, the land, the swamp. And as he sank into the darkness, his last thought was a final acceptance of his fate. He had become one with the house, a part of its eternal, ever-expanding darkness. The echoes of the swamp, of the house, of all those who had come before him, enveloped him. There was no more Daniel, no more struggle, only the house, forever waiting, forever consuming.